Well, we've done it. We've made it all the way through. We've come to the end. This is our graduation ceremony for the 10 Commandments. And how fitting that this final 10th commandment is sort of like a bookend. It kind of matches and mirrors the first commandment. You know, if the first commandment is saying, don't love anything more than God, the 10th commandment is kind of saying, well, here's a list of things that you're probably going to love more than God. Proceed with caution. You know, for us, it might not be a real temptation to covet our neighbor's ox or donkey or their servants. I know I've never been tempted to covet those things, but there are a lot of other things that are around us that might draw our hearts in ways that are unhealthy and destructive. I don't know about you. I don't know if you've ever watched some of those home renovation shows and just seen the enormous, clean, and beautiful homes that are there and thought, man, wouldn't it be nice to live in a place like that? Maybe you're scrolling through Instagram and you see some of those realtors have these great, videos and reels just showcasing these beautiful homes, especially here in Folsom with lakeside views and things like that. And you're like, wow, my house feels so small and dirty and outdated compared to some of these things. Man, wouldn't it be nice to be in a place like that? Or maybe you look around and see someone else's spouse and think, wow, man, wouldn't it be nice to go home to someone who looked like that? Or, look at him. Her husband is so good with the kids and he's such a friendly guy. He can fix anything. And how come my husband can't be a little bit more like that? Maybe you look around and you wish you had a better car and think, man, mine's just a piece of junk. Like, wouldn't it be nice to be able to just drive a new car off the lot? Oh, like what a dream. Looking around and saying, man, I wish I could have a body like that, or a job like that, or a paycheck like that, or a family like that, or a lifestyle like that. Man, I wish I could travel like these people are traveling. Does that sound a little more familiar than maybe coveting an ox or a donkey? We might never say some of these things out loud, but this is what coveting sounds like. This is what the 10th commandment is warning us against. And it's not just a small guilty pleasure kind of thing. Coveting, it's not just something we can brush off and say, it's not really that big a deal. It's not like murdering or stealing. Why is this the 10th commandment? Why is this in the same category as murdering and stealing and committing adultery? Sometimes I can't even help it that these thoughts or these desires come up in my heart. And it's not like it's hurting anybody else. I might want these things, but it's not like I'm actually going to do anything bad because of these desires. But I beg to differ. Actually, if you look at the story of the Bible, I think you can make a strong case that the first and most consequential sin in the whole book is the sin of coveting, of seeing and desiring. It wasn't that long ago that we looked at the early stories of Genesis. We looked at the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and when it describes Eve taking the forbidden fruit, it uses this kind of 4-step movement. It says she saw the fruit, desired it, reached out, and took it. We see this being a pattern of how sin creeps up into people's lives again and again and again. Later in the Bible, when there's a story of King David who's bored one day and he's, kind of patrolling on his roof, looking out over Jerusalem, and he sees Bathsheba bathing. And it uses that same 4-step pattern. It says he saw her, he desired her, he reached out and took her. Seeing and desiring, coveting, might seem like a small thing. But we live in California. We know what a small spark can do when it's set in the wrong place. It can lead to disastrous wildfires. Gazing and desiring might seem small, but they can spark something in us that leads to disastrous consequences. Now, to clarify, the 10th commandment isn't saying that it's wrong to have desires. It's not saying that it's wrong to want good things. Actually, this is one of the core teachings of Buddhism. It's to say that life is suffering, and the way to deal with that suffering is to eliminate desires. that you should not want anything. That's the way to achieve peace. And a lot of people can find some peace of mind with that, but that's not what Christianity teaches. Christianity teaches that desires are a good thing when they're directed at good things, when they're directed at good things in the proper way. Buddhism might say that you should remove all of your desires. Christianity would say you should reorder your desires. You should redirect your desires. Instead of towards things that will bring pain or will bring isolation, redirect your desires to things that bring life, that bring flourishing. Now, all that just to say that there's nothing wrong with having goals or a wish list. However, be careful, because quickly these things can turn into coveting when they're rooted in discontentment. That's what the 10th commandment is about. It's not saying you shouldn't desire to have good things. It's not saying you shouldn't have these goals for maybe improving your life in certain ways. What it's saying is be careful when they stem from discontentment, when it comes from a place of resentment, or when it leads to something that say, they shouldn't have that, I should have that. That's what coveting is warning us against. When we start to think to ourselves that life isn't fair, God really owes us better than what we've got right now, or maybe getting resentful towards people who have things that we wish we really had. This is coveting. That's what the 10th commandment is warning against. Now, for our last sermon, I want to lean a little bit more into the practical side of things, about how the 10th commandment can be lived out in our lives. So this morning, I want to encourage us to all examine 2 attitudes and then 2 practices that can help steer our heart away from coveting, from obsessing over the things that we don't have, away from coveting and towards gratitude. Gratitude is kind of the anti-coveting. Instead of obsessing over the things that we don't have, gratitude means being thankful and satisfied in the things that we do have, if we're willing to see it, if we're willing to notice the gifts that are all around us. And so the first attitude that I want us to examine and explore and hopefully take on together is the attitude that says that everything that you have is a gift. That everything that you have is a gift. Even the things that we think we've earned, well, we think about it, maybe you're like, well, I worked really hard for this. I put in the hours, I put in the effort, and I deserve this thing. I earned it. This isn't a gift. I've earned it. But think for a moment, where did those talents come from? Where did those skills come from? Who taught you these things? Who gave you the body to actually do these things, or the brain to think these things? Everything that we have is a gift. And sometimes we think that joy and gratitude, that there's a formula that goes like this. We work hard to get what we want, and then once we have it, then we can be thankful. Then we can be happy. Then we can be joyful because we've worked hard to get it, and now we have it. Once we have it, then we can be joyful and grateful. Once our desires are met. But actually, the truth is, you can only really experience joy and gratitude when you run that formula in reverse. When you actually start with gratitude first, and then realize the things that you have. It's only when you start with gratitude for what you already have that you end up with deep and lasting joy. And science actually backs this up. Now, there's a speaker, an author, and a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, Brene Brown. You may have heard of some of her work. But in her research, she says that gratitude is actually the only variable that's scientifically linked to joy. We think when we get the things that we want, then we have happiness and joy, and then that makes us thankful. But actually, the research shows it's the opposite. Joy doesn't lead to gratitude. Gratitude leads to joy. Now, do you see how different this is than what we often assume? And do you see why this might mean a covetous heart that's always wanting more will not find any kind of lasting happiness as it just pursues newer and more and better? It's like you may have it for a moment, but as soon as you have it, that joy and that satisfaction fades quickly. Now, if you want a deep and lasting joy, run the old formula in reverse. Start with gratitude and then work your way out from there. And when you're able to look around and be grateful for all of the gifts that you've been given, you'll find the joy that you're really looking for. So that's the first attitude, recognizing that everything that we have is a gift. The second attitude is something that recognizes that what we have is best cared for by God. That our possessions, our things, our life that we've been given, it's best cared for by God. Coveting is a strange, it works in a strange way. It's very self-reinforcing. It drives you to acquire more and better and newer, telling you that you don't have enough or that what you do have isn't good enough. And so in order to quell this desire, you anxiously work to acquire more things, all these things. And then if somehow, even if you do manage to possess them, to get the things that you're desiring or coveting or wanting, even if you do get these things, you finally get your hands on them, you still aren't satisfied. Because now you're just worried you might lose it, or you might break it, or it might become obsolete. You worked so hard to possess this thing. And as a reward for all of your anxious labor that you put towards it, you're given even more anxiety and more worry about now losing it. The Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, he wrote that riches and abundance come hypocritically clad in sheep's clothing, pretending to be security against anxieties, and then they become the object of anxiety. He says, they secure a man against anxieties just about as well as the wolf, which is put to tending the sheep, would secure them against the wolf. We think if we get enough wealth, if we get enough possessions, if we get all the things that we think we need, then we won't have to worry. But actually, all these things then do is become a greater source of worry and anxiety. Anxiety fuels coveting, and it comes about from an attitude that says, I need to take care of all of my things. And the attitude we want to focus on is saying that God can care for us and our possessions. What if we did have this attitude? One that says and knows that God knows everything that you need, and that everything you have and everything you are is cared for by Him. This makes me think about a passage, Philippians 4:13. I've been thinking about it a lot this week. It's the passage that says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. You see a lot of athletes will write this on their shoes or on their under eye tape, and it's very inspiring. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And I was going on a run on Friday, and somebody chalked this verse on the path, Philippians 4:13. And my first thought was like, oh, nice. Like, they're encouraging me on my run. And then my second thought was, wait a minute, this person got that verse totally wrong. Like, that's not what that verse is talking about at all. This verse isn't saying that God is going to give you super athletic abilities if you believe in Him. I'm sorry, Steph Curry. Like, you write that on your shoes every game, but that's not what this passage is saying. This passage isn't about, accomplishing great feats of athletic achievement. This passage is actually talking about wealth and poverty. It's talking about contentment and coveting. Let me read the whole section that it's taken from. The Apostle Paul is writing, and he says, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether I'm well fed or if I'm hungry, whether I'm living with plenty or with want. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I can live in wealth or I can live in poverty. I can have everything I need or I can be completely empty-handed and starving. I can do all these things because I know it's Christ who strengthens me. You see how different this verse is than how maybe superstar athletes might use it. Now, living the 10th commandment means having a joyful unconcern for our possessions, whether we have a lot or whether we have a little. And we can find joy in Christ who gives us strength. Now, this doesn't mean that we should be foolish with our possessions. It doesn't mean that you should leave your wallet on the park bench, when you're there, or never lock your home or your car. What this just means is that ultimately, it isn't the lock that keeps you safe. It's not the lock that keeps your possessions secure. Who you are and what you have is cared for by God. So now those are the two attitudes I want to encourage us to take on. Knowing that everything that we have is a gift, and that everything we have is ultimately cared for by God. And these two attitudes, I think, will go a long way in leading to more grateful and content and joy-filled lives. But as you probably already know, attitudes and actions always go together. It's never enough just to think, yeah, I gotta change my mind to think this way. We need to change our actions and our habits too. They very much go hand in hand. I heard a phrase once that I think makes a lot of sense of this. Somebody said, you're a lot more likely to live your way into a right way of thinking than to think your way into a right way of living. Does that make sense? You're more likely to live your way into a right way of thinking than to think your way into a right way of living. As you take on these practices, as you live this certain way, your mindset begins to adapt, and your thinking becomes clearer and more in line with what's right, more so than if you just work on thinking the right way. You try to get your head straightened out, thinking that this is what's going to lead to living with right actions. It actually goes the other way. You're more likely to live your way into a right way of thinking than to think your way into a right way of living. So what are some things that we can do that might help shape these attitudes in our lives? Well, here's two practical things. One is refuse to be propagandized. Take yourself out of any place that's just trying to sell you something. Remove yourself from places that say you don't have enough, you need more. There's a lot of things that I like about living in a capitalist society, but the way that it fuels our covetous nature is not one of them. How often every day are you hit with messages that say you need more of this? You need to have a better car. You need to have the latest technology. That phone you bought 6 months ago, it's already outdated. You need the next one. You deserve the best. You should treat yourself to the best. You deserve to have all of these things. How can this not move us towards coveting? And we're surrounded with this all the time, always pushing this message that you need more. What you have is not enough. Richard Foster is a Christian author and speaker. He wrote this really great book on the classic Christian disciplines. And he wrote this chapter on the discipline of simplicity, what it means to live a simple life. And in that chapter, I'm going to read sort of a longish quote that he has. He says, because we lack a divine center, our need for security has led us to an insane attachment to things. We really must understand that the lust for affluence in contemporary society is psychotic. And here he quotes the movie Fight Club. It says, we buy things we don't need with money we don't have to impress people we do not like. Doesn't that sum up kind of our society right now? He goes on to say, covetousness we call ambition, hoarding we call prudence, greed we call industry. Now, wouldn't it make sense for us to remove ourselves from some of these situations? To intentionally set up blocks to stop these messages from getting into our heads and into our hearts. Because the truth is, we don't need all of these things. We really don't. Now, to point to a rather extreme example, Richard Byrd was an Arctic explorer. And in his journal, he wrote, in the barren Arctic wasteland, I'm learning that a man can live profoundly without masses of things. Now, this is a guy in the middle of the Arctic with just his tent and whatever he has to survive. And he's saying, I'm learning that I don't need all that stuff that I had back at home. You can live a profoundly deep life without tremendous amounts of possessions and things. And so what are some things that we can do? Well, maybe just something simple like muting the radio or the TV during ads. Maybe get a good ad block on your phone or your computer. Shut out that noise. Maybe it even means taking shopping apps off your phone. If you really do need to buy something online, can't it wait just till you get to a regular computer? Couldn't that maybe stop you from a lot of impulsive purchases? I know I had to do that. No more Amazon on my phone for me. Maybe that can be something that helps you as well. Or maybe just having the awareness to know when you're being sold something. Salespeople are tricky. They're sneaky. And now with algorithms on the internet, it's even trickier and sneakier because they know exactly what you're looking for. You ever have that where you're like talking to somebody about like, oh, I heard about this thing. Wouldn't that be so cool? And then like a couple hours later, it shows up, on your internet browser. I'm like, wait a minute, what? Are they listening? I don't know. I've had those moments, and it kind of freaks me out. And so, how can we become aware of when other people are trying to tell us this message that what you don't have is enough? How can we recognize that and maybe step out of that, shut ourselves off from that, and remind ourselves that what we have in Christ gives us what we need? That we too can live without tremendous masses of things like an Arctic explorer. So that's the first practice, tuning these things out. Refuse to be propagandized. And then the second practice is go to church every Sunday. You might be thinking, of course, the pastor is going to say that this is what we should do to combat this thing. But hear me out. There's a psalm that talks about this exactly. Psalm 73. It says this, and tell me that you can't relate to what he says. He says, "As for me, my feet almost slipped as I envied the arrogant and saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They are free from common human burdens. I thought to myself, surely in vain I've kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence." It's the first part of the psalm. Doesn't that sound like something we can relate with? You can try your hardest to live a good life. Maybe you try really hard to be a good Christian and to follow all 10 commandments. But then it's hard not to look around and see how well other people are doing. How well people are doing who steal and lie and cheat, and they're not getting caught, and their life just seems to be going so smoothly. Sometimes it can feel like the worst people end up with the best lot in life. And you can kind of hear it in the psalmist's voice. This draw to look at them and covet and say, man, why can't I have that? Like, I'm working so hard to be a good person, and they don't even care. And look how good their life is going. It seems so relatable to me. But then the second half of the psalm, it takes a turn. He goes on and he continues to write, "When I tried to understand this, it troubled me deeply until I stepped into the house of the Lord." And then he goes on to pray to God, saying, "Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire besides you. My heart and flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forevermore." My portion forevermore. When we are bombarded every day with messages and images that say you don't have enough, you should look at these people who have it all and you should aspire to be more like them. Wouldn't it be good for your soul if just once a week you gathered together with friends and family and neighbors to hear a different message? To come into the house of the Lord like the psalmist and hear a message that says, don't look at the people who have filled their lives with everything that the world says is valuable, but instead look at the person who emptied himself of everything. To hear a message that says, look at Jesus who emptied himself of everything at the cross so that you could be filled with everything that really matters. Now, this is where you're going to find contentment. The cross is where covetousness goes to die. This is where true joy is found. In a loving relationship with a God who is our portion forevermore. Stepping into a worshiping community helps shift the focus of our hearts away from covetous envy and towards the only one who can fill us with what we really long for. And we talked about desires being a good thing when they're aimed at the right things. Gathering regularly for worship, everything that we do here is about shaping and reorienting and directing our hearts and our loves towards the one who really fills us. Now I'll close with a quote from John Calvin, who unpacks a little bit more just how much it is that Christ gives us when we find ourselves in him. He writes, "This is the wonderful exchange which, out of God's measureless benevolence, he has with us. that becoming Son of Man with us, he has made us sons of God with him. That by Jesus' descent to earth, he has prepared an ascent to heaven for us. That by taking on our mortality, he has conferred immortality to us. That accepting our weakness, he has strengthened us by his power. That receiving our poverty unto himself, he has transferred his wealth to us. And that taking the weight of our iniquity upon himself, he has clothed us with his righteousness. What more could we want? Let's pray.